Chapter 2406. As soon as he looked up, he saw Qin Chen leaning against the side with a blade of grass in his mouth. He was still dressed as a man. He was so handsome. To be honest, he was not feminine at all when he was a man. He was really beautiful. However, what troubled Zhou Chengwang was that Qin Chen did not have the gentleness of a young girl, and he was cunning that men did not have. His eyes, just take Qin Chen as written by a man, often seemed to be mocking Zhou Chengwang, as if he could see through everything. Zhou Chengwang was often embarrassed by his gaze. He thought about it carefully before answering Qin Chen. It depends on fate. Qin Chen smiled. You're very cautious. Why are you afraid of me? Zhou Chengwang snorted. That's because you're Qin Mu's younger brother. Is this considered a personal attack? Qin Chen's voice was still lazy and carried a hint of indifference. Zhou Chengwang smiled and said, let's see how you interpret it. There was a hint of appreciation in Qin Chen's beautiful eyes. Okay, you've passed. He left the way he came and took Xiao Yishu away. This child was quite cute. Her whole body smelled like milk buns, and she was raised by that pervert, Lan Yu. However, she was cute and stupid. He quite liked her. The author really likes the character Qin Chen. Please don't stop the author from writing about him. I'm so fascinated. Zhou Chengguang narrowed his eyes. A woman who was more handsome than a man. And she was Qin Mu's compatriot. Fortunately, his Mumu was not like this. Otherwise, Zhou Chengguang could not imagine how he could hug a good-looking man and have sex. He was sure that Qin Chen must be in airport, looking at his thin body and his long and straight legs. It was not out of place to dress up as a man. No, she was not pretending to be a man. He was a man. Zhou Chengguang looked at him for a long time and smiled. Qin Chen took the little milk buns and played with them for a long time. When the party was over, he returned them to Yi Muyun. When Xiao Yishu left, she waved at Qin Chen reluctantly. Goodbye, uncle. Cher covered her face. Qin Chen smiled faintly. Goodbye, little brother. Shuai sneaked a peek at Yi Muyun and noticed that the muscles at the corner of his mouth were twitching slightly. She thought about it. One was his younger brother, no, his younger sister, and the other was his son, not his daughter. All of them were like this. No wonder he had a headache. At this time, Cher still felt sorry for him and forgot that she was actually Xiao Yishu's mother. On the way back, Cher sat in the passenger seat and looked at Yi Muyun from time to time. He reached out and held her fingertips. Why do you keep peeking at me, huh? Of course not. She blurted out. Yi Muyun smiled and did not expose her. In fact, he knew what she was thinking. In fact, Qin Chen's dressing and style of doing things were no longer a problem for him. The entire Qin family was up to him. After all, he was already an adult and knew what he wanted. Moreover, he had been independent since he was a child and had never suffered losses. But Yishu was different. She was still young and had not established her values. She was also soft-hearted, very much like Cher. A male version of Cher. He didn't dare to think about it. But his little wife was not worried at all and was still watching him make a fool of himself. Chapter 2407. Xiao Yishu, who was sitting in the back seat, had been secretly observing them. She knew that their marriage was almost set in stone. The little girl was half lying down, and her little face was full of disappointment. Yi Muyun also saw it from the rearview mirror, and he couldn't help smiling. His child was so cute whether she was dissatisfied with him or angry with him. He just looked at her, and then focused on driving. It was a snowy night, and the road was a little slippery. He slowed down the car. Cher didn't talk to him anymore, for fear that she might affect his driving. Under the streetlights, the fine snow was falling, so clear that it could be seen. The road was already covered with a thin layer of white. Yi Muyun drove a little slower, and his handsome face flickered under the passing headlights. At a crossroad in front of them, a truck suddenly slanted in their direction. The slippery road made the speed of the truck even faster, but it was also more dangerous. Yi Muyun braked, and the car screeched, but still rushed forward at a very slow speed. The truck was getting closer and closer. He quickly held the steering wheel with his slender hands, and began to reverse the car. He reversed very fast, and then drove forward toward the roadside. With a bang, the front of the car hit a wire pole. The front of the car was smoking. And the truck brushed past his car, and finally turned over on the roadside with a bang. Yi Muyun leaned on the steering wheel, and when he came to his senses, he turned his head. Cher also came to her senses, and realized that there was a lot of blood on his forehead, and blood kept dripping from his arm. She covered her little mouth. "I'm fine," he said calmly, and quickly straightened his seat, and stepped to the back seat to pick up his little girl. Although Xiao Yishu sat in the child's seat, she still hurt her legs, and blood kept oozing from her pants. Yi Muyun couldn't care about anything else, and while unfastening the little girl's seatbelt, he ordered Cher, "Call Qin Chen, and ask him to arrange an ambulance to come here. We can give blood in the ambulance." Although Cher was worried about him, she was more willing to listen to him at this time. In such a cold, dark, and helpless night, he was injured, but he could still give her a sense of security. She was even more clear that he had hit himself like this in order to protect her and Ishu. She was afraid of blood, but she could not faint now. He and Ishu both needed her. Cher's hands trembled as she pursed her lips. Resolutely, she dialed Qin Chen's number and briefly explained the situation. Then, she looked at the roadside sign that indicated the location. Qin Chen informed the hospital and quickly drove over. Yi Muyun's blood continued to flow. He had lost a lot of blood, and it was a ghastly sight. Although Xiao Yishu's wound wasn't big, it was still bleeding profusely. On such a snowy night, it was truly despairing. However, Cher was braver than ever before. She took out a few towels from the car and bandaged them up carefully. However, the blood on Yi Muyun's arm continued to drip down continuously. Looking at it drop by drop, it looked terrifying. "Brother." Finally, Cher couldn't help sobbing. His voice comforted her gently, "Be good, I'm fine." He held Xiao Yishu in his arms. He was afraid that she would be scared, so he kept coaxing her. It was just like how he coaxed her when she was young. Cher's eyes were filled with tears. Now she finally understood what his feelings for her were like from the past to the present. Chapter 2408. He gave the only woolen blanket to Ishu and wrapped her up in it. The child's body was weak and she could not catch a cold. Otherwise, she would definitely have a fever. Not only that, he even used his own body heat to warm her up. He took off the sweater and used the warmest part of his chest to warm her up. Xiao Yishu felt dizzy and uncomfortable. She felt that she was being held in a warm embrace. It was a very warm embrace, just like her father's. She called out softly. Yi Muyun's voice was deep. "Daddy's here." Xiao Yishu struggled to open her eyes and looked up at that handsome face in the dark. There was a lot of blood and it was blurry. But she could tell that it was Yi Sansan. Yi Sansan had bled a lot, but why was he still hugging her so tightly? Xiao Yishu closed her eyes tiredly. She lowered her head in Yi Muyun's embrace and mumbled for a long time. Her little fingers secretly hugged his waist and she breathed out weakly. Uncle, am I going to die? Nonsense, how can that be? I will always watch over our Xiao Shu. Yi Muyun shook his head. His vision was blurry, but he had to hold on. He had to give Ishu a blood transfusion. Also, Cher would be afraid if he fainted. He forced himself to talk to little Ishu. He did not let her sleep, nor did he let her be afraid. The blood on his arm continued to flow. It was so much that Xiao Ishu was afraid. She finally cried out softly. Uncle, are you going to die? He let out a long sigh. No. But he knew that if the ambulance did not arrive soon, he might bleed to death. Cher was on the verge of tears. But she did not dare to cry. She could only press on his wound tightly so that his blood would not flow so quickly. She tried her best to suppress her emotions, afraid that she would cry and upset him. In such a dark, icy night, their hearts were once again together. And this time, there was their child. Qin Chen and the ambulance arrived at almost the same time. As soon as his car stopped, he opened the door and jumped out. He immediately opened the back door and carefully carried Ishu out. He then asked in a low voice, Brother, can you still walk? Help me up, Cher. Yi Muyun's voice was a bit weak as he spoke in a low and hoarse voice. Cher replied with an "oh" and helped him out of the car with tears streaming down her face. Then, she got into the ambulance with great difficulty. Qin Chen was already preparing the blood bag. He looked at Yi Muyun and asked, Can you hold on? Because Xiao Ishu could not be delayed. Yi Muyun clenched his teeth. Draw. Qin Chen looked at him quietly and quickly began to draw blood. After inserting the needle, he started to help him stop the bleeding. His actions were so swift that it made people's hair stand on end. There was not a single trace of emotion in his actions. Cher gulped. She was worried about Yi Muyun and Xiao Ishu. Qin Chen's technique was very good. Very soon, Yi Muyun's bleeding had stopped. But he was still drawing blood. After drawing about 300 milliliters of blood, his face turned pale. Qin Chen's voice was very calm. Can you still hold on? Yi Muyun smiled faintly. Yes. Cher's fingers were twisted together as she looked at him uneasily. As for Qin Chen, he cruelly changed another blood bag and gave the blood he drew to Xiao Ishu. Yi Muyun's face was getting paler and paler. He had drawn 2 full bags of blood. Chapter 2409. Actually, the amount of blood Xiao Ishu needed was not enough, but the 600 milliliters were enough for them to reach the hospital. Needless to say, Yi Muyun could not hold on any longer. He was in shock. Put him on a drip. Qin Chen ordered the nurse expressionlessly while he took care of Xiao Ishu. His brother's body should be able to take it, but Xiao Ishu needed careful care. Cher stayed by Yi Muyun's side because Xiao Ishu had Qin Chen by her side. Although Qin Chen had always been cool, she trusted him, very much. She looked at Yi Muyun, bit her lip and asked Qin Chen, Will he be alright? Probably. He won't die. Qin Chen winked at her. Don't worry, I'll keep him alive so that you can get married. Cher pursed her lips and did not say a word. She kept holding his hand, hoping that he would suddenly wake up. But that night, Yi Muyun did not wake up. The ambulance arrived at Xingyuan Hospital an hour later. Qin Chen arranged a ward for him. He did not want to sleep tonight because Xiao Ishu's bleeding had not stopped. Yi Muyun could not draw any more for the time being. If he did, he might die. It was a snowy night, and Xingyuan Hospital was so quiet that one could hear a pin drop. But the emergency room was still brightly lit. Yi Muyun was still unconscious, and he had a fever of 39. 5 degrees Celsius. Qin Chen forcefully put him on an 4 drip. He did not have time to care about him. He took a blood bag and brought a nurse to the VIP ward on the top floor. The door opened, and Lan Yu was lying quietly. Although it was late, he was not asleep. At that moment, the lights in the ward suddenly turned on, and it was very dazzling. Lan Ding opened his eyes and stared at the person who suddenly appeared. It was that black-hearted quack again, and he even had a needle in his hand. "What are you doing here again?" Lan Yu's expression was a little guarded. Qin Chen didn't have time to put on his white coat. He was wearing a thin woolen coat, which made his cold face look good and beautiful. This was also the first time that Lan Yu had seen this sissy wearing casual clothes. Lan Yu was a little reluctant to admit that this sissy had a very good innate condition. Although he was only about 175 centimeters tall, his aura was no weaker than a man who was more than 180 centimeters tall. However, no matter how good-looking this quack was, it couldn't change the fact that he had done evil. Lan Yu glared at him. Qin Chen walked over quickly with his long limbs. "Your blood. I've just tested it. It's a special blood type. Although your body is incomplete now, I don't want to use your blood if there's a way." After that, he asked the nurse to press him down, and he rolled up Lan Yu's sleeves. That aura was like a king forcing himself on a bow. The bright red blood flowed into the blood bag like a column, but the speed was a little slow. After all, Lan Yu had just turned from a vegetable to a normal person. Qin Chen also knew that his body was not suitable for drawing blood at this moment. What he did was no different from a robber, and it was against his professional ethics. But at this moment, he couldn't care less. Lan Yu was restrained by a nurse, and the quack in front of him was doing whatever he wanted to him. He almost cursed. For 30 years, Lan Yu was sure that he had never seen such a shameless doctor. This was simply drawing his blood now, and with a face full of disdain, he said that the quality of his blood was not good. "Fuck you." Chapter 24:10. Lan Yu was stunned. Then he gritted his teeth. "Where's Yimuyun? Where's her father?" Although he asked this, he didn't struggle anymore. Qin Chen's eyes fell on the blood vessels. The speed was getting slower and slower. He looked at Lan Yu's skinny body and almost thought that he had drained him dry. Qin Chen decisively pulled out the needle and looked at the blood bag. It was about 150 milliliters. Although it wasn't much, it was better than nothing. He lowered his head and looked at Lan Yu's pale and thin face. He said softly, "Yimuyun lost too much blood and is now in a coma. I just drained another 600 milliliters." He paused for a moment and said in a lighter tone, "If Ishu needs it, he has to continue draining because he's her father." Qin Chen knew that for the little fellow, Yimuyun would be willing to give up his life. For his own child, he would be willing to do anything. As he said this, Lan Yu closed his eyes. "Drain me. Until I'm dry." Since he was already like this, he was willing to give Ishu the best, a father who loved her dearly and a complete family. Qin Chen put away the blood bag and looked at the man on the bed in surprise. He pursed his thin lips and said coldly, "I will when necessary." He walked very fast. When his hand was on the doorknob, Lan Yu stopped him. "I want to see the child." Qin Chen answered quickly, "Let's do it at dawn." After that, he didn't leave. When he connected Lan Yu's blood to Ishu's bleeding stopped. He cursed in his heart. Damn, the blood of this vegetable was really useful. Xiao Ishu calmed down a little. Qin Chen asked the nurse to take care of her and went to see his brother. Yimuyun's fever had not subsided, and his whole body was covered in sweat. Cher was trying her best to help him cool down. Qin Chen took the towel from her hand and said mildly, "Let me do it." Cher looked at him eagerly. Qin Chen's movements were very professional, and he quickly completed the cooling process. After that, he looked at Cher. Take a nap first. Cher shook her head. I'm not sleeping. Qin Chen looked at her for a while and smiled. Okay, you look after my brother. I'll take care of Ishu. In fact, it could be seen even in a consultation room. Although the situation was stable now, no one was in the mood to sleep. They felt that they would only feel at ease when the sun rose. For the time being, he didn't dare to let his family know about this, for fear that they would be worried. The snowy night was especially long. Cher supported herself and stayed up the whole night for the first time. Sometimes, she could see the thick night through the window when she turned her head. After 2 seconds, she turned back to look at Yi Muyun and Xiao Yishu. Qin Chen patted her shoulder and handed her a cup of hot coffee. It'll be fine. Cher took it and held it in her palm. After a while, she suddenly remembered something. Where did you go just now? Qin Chen smiled and coughed. I went to Lan Yu's ward to get his blood drawn. Cher was a little speechless. Lan Yu was already in such a state, and Qin Chen still had the heart to do it. Ishu's problem is quite tricky. If you and my brother have a way, let's have another child. That's how Qin Mo was born to me, Qin Chen said straightforwardly. Cher lowered her head and made a sound of acknowledgement, not rebuking him. After a while, she looked up. How is Lan Yu? He won't die. Qin Chen smiled. Go and see him in the morning. Chapter 24:11. Is there a difference? Regardless of whether he's willing or not, I'll still do it. Qin Chen smiled wickedly. Of course, he can sue me, but he won't have any evidence. This was the first time Cher had met someone like Qin Chen, a girl. She couldn't take it. No, she wasn't a girl at all. He was a domineering man. On this point, she and Zhou Chongguang had reached an agreement. Qin Chen smiled again and put down the coffee in his hand. He looked at Cher and said, Don't worry, I know what I'm doing. I won't joke around with his life unless he's willing. Usually, he wouldn't explain anything to others. If others misunderstood, then so be it. However, Cher was his brother's most important woman and also his sister-in-law. Hence, he was willing to say a few more words. Cher was a little embarrassed by his gaze. Her little heart was pounding. Gosh, this was the first time she was embarrassed by someone of the same gender. She pursed her lips. Do you intend to be like this forever? Qin Chen looked at her seriously. Do you want to be a man? Cher didn't say anything. It was a tacit agreement. Qin Chen pursed his lips and said in a low voice, In my heart, there's no gender distinction. Do you understand? Cher looked at him for a long time and stammered, Then do you like men or women? She was thinking that Qin Chen probably liked girls. However, Qin Chen smiled. I don't know yet. Maybe I like both. Cher was speechless. They couldn't continue the conversation. However, as they chatted, the sky was about to turn bright. There was a hint of white in the sky. Qin Chen got up. I'll go check on them. Cher grunted in acknowledgement. Finally, after a night, both father and daughter were fine. Yi Muyun woke up at 7 in the morning. His body was still weak. Xiao Yishu woke up at 8 and complained of dizziness the moment she woke up. Too much blood loss. Qin Chen said indifferently, I can only slowly replenish it. He looked at Yi Muyun and said, Can you smoke a little more? Yishu will hurt her brain. When he spoke, Xiao Yishu looked at him with tears rolling down her cheeks. Xiao Yishu, don't hurt your brain. Will Ishu become a fool? The little guy was crying sadly, weak and sad. His appearance really made people feel sorry for him. Draw another 200. Yi Muyun walked over and rubbed the little guy's head. Uncle Chin is lying to you. Xiao Ishu blinked her teary eyes, still looking extremely sad. Meanwhile, the cold-blooded quack had already prepared a blood bag and was about to draw her brother's blood like a blood-sucking demon king. Cher's heart ached to the point of death, but it was useless even if she did. Moreover, Yi Muyun insisted on drawing her brother's blood. Qin Chen didn't show any mercy. He calmly drew his brother's blood. The little guy blinked his big eyes and looked at him. There were tears in the corner of his eyes, but he forgot to cry. His little face was especially lovable. Yi Muyun's face became paler and paler. He sat there and his body was trembling slightly. Xiao Ishu's little hand gently tugged at Qin Chen's sleeve. She asked tearfully, "Will Yi Sansan die?" Qin Chen smiled faintly. "You can't say for sure." Little Lon Error immediately burst into tears. "I don't want Yi Sansan to die, then are you willing to become a little fool?" Qin Chen asked coldly. Chapter 24:12. In other words, you'd rather be a little fool than let Yi Sansan die, right? Qin Chen said coldly. The little fellow was no match for him. She cried and nodded. Wah, wah, wah. I don't want Yi Sansan to die. Qin Chen shrugged and threw Yi Muyun a mocking look. Pfft. How could such a little fool manage Boyi when he couldn't even deal with her? Yi Muyun couldn't care less about that. He only cared about his little milk boy. Xiao Yishu stumbled into his arms and cried loudly. Daddy, I don't want you to die. Sob, sob, sob. The little fool cried loudly in his arms. He hugged the little fellow, feeling both sad and sweet. This was a completely different experience from hugging Cher. After all, the little one in his arms was his own flesh and blood. Yi Muyun gently inhaled the little fellow's scent. There was a hint of pain on his handsome face. It was like regaining something that was lost and getting what he wanted. It wasn't an exaggeration to describe it with all sorts of words. At this moment, he almost forgot that he was drawing blood. His strength was slowly weakening, and he could barely carry Xiao Yishu. The new nanny father fainted in embarrassment again. Amidst Yishu's earth-shattering cries, Qin Chen asked the nurse for an intravenous drip. He said in disgust, "How can you give Shui happiness with this broken body?" Cher's expression was similar to Xiao Yishu's. She wanted to cry but didn't dare to. Hearing Qin Chen's words, she raised her little paw. "Your brother is fine." Qin Chen was stunned for a moment, then he chuckled softly. Shui was such a treasure, she was so dumb that she was adorably cute. He reached out to pick up Xiao Yishu and pressed her little body on the bed. He said with rare gentleness, "Be good. Yi Sansan won't die if you don't cry. Also, call him daddy and he'll live a long life." "You're lying to me." Little friend Lon Error's eyes were brimming with tears. After a long time, he finally spoke. Qin Chen narrowed his eyes and smiled. "At least you're not too stupid." As he spoke, he glanced at Shui. Shui hung her head low. At the entrance of the emergency department, Lan Yu sat in his wheelchair and watched silently. She watched as Yi Muyun fainted, watched as Yishu cried for her father, and watched as Cher guarded Yi Muyun like a wife. Everything was so perfect, and there was no place for him to stand. He had completely lost. It started with hatred and ended with his heart beating fast. Lan Yu's thin face trembled violently. He smiled bitterly and raised his hand to signal the nurse beside him. "Let's go back to the ward." The nurse looked at him sympathetically. Sigh, Mr. Blue's expression looked as if he had been made a cuckold. Previously, when he returned to the country, he was quite high profile, showing off his wife and children. So, none of them belonged to him. The nurse sighed. Mr. Lon was really unlucky. When he was sick, he fell into the hands of Dr. Cheen. Dr. Cheen was kind to female patients, but when it came to male patients, it was infuriating. The nurse nodded and silently prepared to push Lon Yu back to the ward. However, the moment he left, Cheen Chen noticed him and looked up. Cheen Chen did not alarm anyone. She just looked at Lon Yu quietly. Looking at the disillusionment in his eyes, Lon Yu left in a sorry state. The nurse pushed him, and he pushed the wheel. His hand was almost crushed. Cheen Chen only looked at him for a few seconds before she lowered her eyes and continued to transfuse blood into Xiao Yishu. However, the corner of her mouth curved up slightly, revealing a faint smile. Chapter 24:13. Xiao Yishu blinked her big teary eyes. Won't Yi Sansan die? You have to call him Daddy. Cheen Chen smiled and reached out to rub the little girl. Xiao Yishu's gaze fell on Yi Muyan again. She pursed her lips, feeling a little embarrassed. Cheen Chen didn't force her. He hung up the little girl and asked the nurse to buy some breakfast. His voice was very gentle when he instructed the nurse, and the nurse blushed. Cher looked at him eagerly. She felt that Cheen Chen was too immersed in his role and seemed to be enjoying a woman's adoration. Cheen Chen knew that she was looking at him. He only smiled. His faint smile was so beautiful that it could make one scream. Even Cher felt that she was about to fall under Cheen Chen's casual pants. This world was too fantastical. She immediately looked away from Cheen Chen, but Cheen Chen winked at her. It was like a brother-in-law seducing his sister-in-law. Cher felt that if she were to become gay one day, the person she would become gay with would be Cheen Chen. Would Yi Muyun beat her to death then? She felt that it was highly possible. Cheen Chen looked at Yi Muyun again. Then he put his hand in his pocket and said mildly, I'm going to the office to change. You sleep for a while. They're fine. Cher nodded and then lay down beside Xiao Yishu carefully. She was indeed very tired. Cheen Chen looked at her, and with a gentle expression, he left with light steps. He walked back to the office and took off his coat. It was a light brown sweater with a dark blue checkered shirt inside. It was a perfect match, and he wore a pair of dark-colored casual pants. He threw his coat casually on the back of the sofa and went to the water dispenser to pour himself a glass of water. His full-time nurse secretary stood beside him, reporting his work today with a blushing face. Cheen Chen listened a little absent-mindedly. After the nurse finished speaking, he poured some water and said calmly, I remember there was a surgery at 4 in the afternoon. The nurse paused for a moment and then said apologetically, that patient passed away last night. Cheen Chen's hand that was in the middle of drinking water paused. He raised his eyes, and there was a hint of surprise in his eyes. After a while, he said calmly, who's on duty? Can people die in the hospital? The young nurse hesitated for a moment. The patient's family refused to pay the fee at the last minute. So, the patient ran outside, and jumped into the river. Cheen Chen glanced at her, and then the nurse was not sure if she had heard it clearly. Did Dr. Cheen swear just now? After a brief moment of silence, Cheen Chen said softly, got it, you can leave first. The nurse breathed a sigh of relief. She must have been hallucinating just now. How could Dr. Cheen swear? She left and even considerately closed the door. Cheen Chen was still standing there, holding his thermos flask in his hand. He looked at it for a long time before taking a sip. He drank very slowly. There was a hint of bitterness in the flask, and he tasted it on the tip of his tongue. Every time, when he was helpless, he tasted it. Qin Chen stood in the morning light, letting the faint sunlight shine on his body. It was warm, but it could not warm him up. He was not old, but maybe because he was a surgeon, he felt that his heart was numb sometimes. He had seen too many deaths. At this moment, his heart was empty. He stood by the window, holding a cup of hot tea. He felt that the tea in his hand was the only warmth at this moment. Chapter 24:14. Yi Muyun had already woken up. There was a little guy in his arms as he had wished. At this moment, Mr. Yi was reaching out to stroke the little curly hair. His expression was indescribably loving. Cher was kneeling beside him like a little puppy. Qin Chen stood at the door and watched quietly. What a loving family of three. He watched for a while but didn't go in. He put his hand on his white coat and walked towards the elevator. When he arrived at the VIP ward on the top floor, Qin Chen pushed the door open. Lan Yu had already been moved back to the hospital bed. At this moment, he was lying on his back and seemed to be in a daze. Qin Chen had seen many patients, but he had never seen a patient as passive as Lan Yu. He looked like he didn't care about life and death. He didn't care about everything around him because the things he cared about were gone. Qin Chen had never experienced love. Just as Cher asked, he didn't know whether he liked men or women, but he understood human nature. This was a doctor who had to be compassionate as soon as he entered the profession. But after so many years, he had become so used to hiding it that he almost ignored himself. When Qin Chen came in, the nurse subconsciously said, "Good morning, Dr. Qin." Qin Chen nodded faintly and walked over slowly. He stood at the head of Lan Yu's bed. "How are you today?" Lan Yu's gaze shifted to him. His speed was very slow. Although he was very young, he gave off the feeling that he was about to die. But his eyes instantly had a hint of mockery. "Are you referring to this leg of mine or the other leg?" There was a hint of mockery in Lan Yu's tone. Originally, this kind of mockery was only shown to women, but he said it to this overly beautiful male doctor. After saying it, he felt that he was crazy. Qin Chen didn't care. "I have to examine it to know." Lan Yu narrowed his eyes and asked subconsciously, "What do you want to do now?" Qin Chen gave the young nurse a look, and the young nurse immediately brought a medical tray over. He looked at Qin Chen quietly and said in a hoarse voice, "Don't worry, I won't destroy them again." With that, he gently closed his eyes. Qin Chen smiled. "That's great." He looked at the man in front of him and said calmly, "I'm curious what you've been up to all these years." Lan Yu ignored him. His eyes were still closed, as if refusing to communicate with him. Qin Chen didn't say anything. He just smiled faintly and looked at the two nurses. "Get ready, I'm going to help Mr. Lan unblock his blood vessels." Lan Yu's eyes widened as he stared at her suspiciously. Then, he said with certainty, "You're in a bad mood." There was still a faint smile on Qin Chen's face. He put his hands in his pockets and did not deny it. "Yes, I'm not in a good mood." Lan Yu narrowed his eyes and reminded him gloomily, "Dr. Qin, you're a doctor." He didn't care about what happened last night because it was issue, but if this quack dared to use him as a punching bag now, the next second, that overly beautiful face was in front of him, and his voice was very low and hoarse. "What are you going to do?" "Well, stand up and fight with me, huh?" Lan Yu's face became even uglier. This wasn't just a quack, but a demon. He was livid and reached out to wave the person in front of him away. "I don't want you to treat me. I want to change the attending doctor." Qin Chen easily grabbed his arm and restrained him. Chapter 24:15. For Lan Yu, it was shameful. His hand was held by an excessively beautiful man and he could not fight back. At that moment, he was extremely embarrassed. He could not wait to get rid of this gigolo immediately. Qin Chen looked down at their intertwined hands. The entanglement of black and white was quite a visual impact. He smiled faintly. Sure. Let's see if the hospital approves it. Lan Yu gritted his teeth. I'll change to another hospital. Can't I? Yes, but I promise that in China, no one can cure your leg except for me. Qin Chen straightened his body and let go of his hand. Think about it carefully. Do you want to continue to be tortured by me or lie on the bed and accept a hopeless life? You might not be able to stand up in the future. Think about that situation. Lie down and draw. Lan Yu almost went crazy. He stared at this beautiful gigolo and could not do anything to him. Qin Chen's expression became serious. He glanced at the nurse. Is everything ready? It was he who spoiled these nurses so much that they did not do their proper work and only knew how to watch gossip. The nurse immediately ran out and closed the door. Qin Chen did not pay any more attention to Lan Yu. He walked directly to the window and stood quietly. Lan Yu lay down and looked sideways. He could see the side of Qin Chen's face. It was the kind of handsome man with good facial features. Especially the bridge of his nose, it was straight and elegant. His thin lips had a light pink color. He was a handsome man in a comic book style. Lan Yu was an artist himself. It was probably because the lines were too good that he looked at it for a long time. He kept looking at it and forgot to move his eyes away. Qin Chen's slender body was wrapped in a sweater and trousers of good quality. The white coat outside was spotless. No matter how one looked at him, he looked like an excellent young man. However, he was extremely bad-tempered. Lan Yu did not know how long he looked until Qin Chen's slightly hoarse voice sounded. Have you seen enough? Lan Yu was stunned. He coughed uncomfortably. Have you broken up? So you are in a bad mood. Qin Chen quietly looked back at Lan Yu. His red phoenix eyes slightly narrowed. That was a signal that he did not want to be seen through. His thin lips even curled up slightly with a touch of mockery. Do you think I have a girlfriend? Lan Yu heard from the nurse that Qin Chen was only 22 years old. To him, he was still too young to grow hair on his lips. But compared with Qin Mu, Qin Chen was obviously much more experienced, so it was not strange that he had a girlfriend. However, she didn't know what kind of woman could control Qin Chen's temper. He was too hard to understand. Just as they were talking, the nurse came in. As soon as she came in, she felt that the atmosphere inside was not right. However, the nurse did not say much. Qin Yun Lan, she said. Mr. Lan Yu, prepare it for Mr. Lan Yu as well. Qin Chen's voice was especially indifferent. The nurse nodded and smiled awkwardly at Lan Yu. Mr. Lan, we're going to do it. As she said that, she waved her chicken claw in the air. After all, Mr. Lan was still very repulsed by the t-shirt. Sure enough, as soon as the nurse finished speaking, Lan Yu frowned slightly. I'll do it myself. The nurse's voice became even softer. Believe me, Mr. Lan, you can't do it yourself. Lan Yu suddenly exploded. I don't even know how to take off a pair of pants. After that, he panted. The air was full of embarrassment. Chapter 24:16. The nurse was frightened. Qin Chen's voice was indifferent. You can leave. I'll do it. The nurse was shocked. How could he let the Honorable Dr. Qin do such a dirty and tiring job? However, Qin Chen insisted. Go out and close the door. Mr. Lan probably can't accept the opposite sex touching his body. The nurse still went out. Lan Yu stared at Qin Chen and panted. How do you want to torture me? You're very weak. Qin Chen stood beside his bed. He was surrounded by a cold aura. This aura was not what a doctor should have. It was more like the god of death. Lan Yu looked at him. His eyes followed the movement of Qin Chen's body. Qin Chen stopped and looked at Lan Yu condescendingly. But you're very excited, yes. Lan Yu's Adam's apple moved a little. It's like being stained with something that you know you shouldn't be stained with. Qin Chen lowered his head slightly. His beautiful face was in front of Lan Yu's face. His breath was cold. You like me to treat you like this, don't you? Lan Yu closed his eyes slightly. I'm the patient. You're the doctor. You said that you're treating me. But you're addicted to it. Qin Chen curved his thin lips and chuckled. When your legs are healed, find a few good-looking boys. Maybe you'll have a different feeling. Lan Yu's thoughts were exposed. Yes. He might not like Qin Chen, but he found that he liked the looks of men. The kind of handsome and cool comic book handsome men. Sometimes in the middle of the night, he couldn't fall asleep. His mind was thinking about nothing else but what Qin Chen had done to him. Those imaginations were too secretive and crazy. He thought more and more carefully. Then, his heart was guilty. Therefore, he hated Qin Chen even more. He hated his good-looking face, hated his slender figure, and even hated him for always dressing so cleanly and appropriately. In short, he hated Qin Chen's perfection. At this time, in Lan Yu's world, Qin Chen's appearance and Qin Chen's perfection seemed to be a contrast to his imperfection. Qin Chen didn't say anything else. He started working in a slightly rough manner. Today, the puncture to the femur was to be made again, to stimulate the nerves which had no feeling. After so many days, Lan Yu was also a little disappointed because his legs really didn't feel anything at all. Not only his legs, but that thing also didn't move. He felt that he was a completely useless person. It was only when the beautiful Dr. Qin treated him that he felt a little perverted. He had never dared to think about this feeling, but Qin Chen already knew it. Lan Yu was very, very angry. Qin Chen raised his eyes slightly, and his dark eyes met Lan Yu's. In Lan Yu's view, both of them were men. He couldn't. He only felt a little uncomfortable, but he didn't feel particularly humiliated. If it was a man in front of him, everything would be different. Lan Yu said softly, "Don't be too stressed. Also, relax yourself. Or, when your legs are better, find a beautiful little boy. You'll be fine." Lan Yu blurted out, "Will you let me try?" After saying that, Lan Yu felt a little regretful. But men always had some bad habits. They wouldn't take back what they said. Therefore, he looked at Qin Chen with a burning gaze to see how he would deal with it. Would this pretty boy blush? Chapter 24:17. After he finished asking, Qin Chen's eyes were a little deep and bottomless. Even an old and young man like Lan Yu was a little dazed and felt a little at a loss. Their eyes met for a long time before Qin Chen finally said calmly, "I'm very expensive." Very expensive. Does that mean it's not impossible? Lan Yu was a little surprised. Qin Chen likes men. Do you think I will like you with your current appearance? The tip of Qin Chen's nose gently touched his. Of course, you have to pay the price. Lan Yu was stunned. This was a Dr. Qin that he had never seen before. He couldn't hide his darkness from head to toe, and he was too lazy to hide it. He even had a feeling that Qin Chen didn't care whether he liked men or women. Or, a person like Qin Chen wouldn't like anyone at all. He always looked at everything from the perspective of God. Everything around him, in fact, couldn't enter his heart. Lan Yu was a painter, or a soul painter. He saw through the darkness of Qin Chen, the things that others couldn't see. After Qin Chen finished speaking, a thin needle in his hand slowly pierced into Lan Yu's knee. The soreness and pain made people unable to describe what it felt like. Fine sweat oozed out of Lan Yu's forehead. He no longer cared about the beautiful man. The pain made him feel like dying. And that quack didn't show any mercy at all. He took out more than 10 needles and pierced them into his flesh one by one. Lan Yu's hand was on the side of the bed. He looked at Qin Chen's handsome face, which was still spotless, and gritted his teeth. Qin Chen, you are a person with a dark heart. You are not suitable to be a doctor at all. After he finished speaking, he clearly felt Qin Chen's body tremble. Then, Qin Chen's gaze was very cold as he stared at him. His voice was soft and slow. Lan Yu, you'd better stay alive. Otherwise, you might not have the chance to take revenge. After saying that, his fingers gently stroked those thin needles, and only then did Lan Yu know what it meant to live a life worse than death. He almost cursed out loud, "Bastard. Didn't you want me to try it?" Qin Chen's beautiful eyes were full of coldness. "If I can't cure your leg, how can I try it? Mr. Lan." He was terrifyingly calm, and there was not a trace of warmth in his eyes as he looked at her. Only then did Lan Yu realize that all the little romance just now was just his wishful thinking. Qin Chen had never taken it seriously. At this moment, Lan Yu secretly swore in his heart that once his leg recovered, he would definitely press down on Qin Chen and see if he could do it. Or maybe he was already prepared. If Qin Chen could do it, then it didn't matter. For the first time, Lan Yu admitted that he was a pervert in his heart. He took a fancy to this gigolo, not because of love, but because he was a lover. He just wanted to get him, he just wanted to mess with him. Qin Chen originally wanted to torture Lan Yu, but later, he also felt that it was a little boring. No matter how weak Lan Yu was, no matter how bad he was not that person. He was not the person who was weak enough to give up his life and leave him. He suddenly stopped, smiled faintly, and pulled out the needles from Lan Yu's leg one by one. Lan Yu's voice was very low, hoarse. Qin Chen's hand paused for a moment, and he sneered, "You're moaning like a virgin." Lan Yu's face darkened, then he bit the pillow, and endured it. Chapter 24:18. Lan Yu was sweating all over, lying down and panting, looking at Qin Chen. He would not be kind enough to think that this quack was treating him just now, so he did not take Qin Chen's words to heart. He did not try. Qin Chen's eyes became cold. "If you are not willing to take this step, my treatment can only cure your body, but not your soul, because you will not learn to trust others." Lan Yu tilted his head and sneered, "What about you, Dr. Qin? Do you trust others again?" Qin Chen's beautiful face got close to him, and his voice was so low that it was almost whispering, "I have never seen a patient like you, who always wants to take off the doctor's clothes." Lan Yu looked deeply into his eyes and wanted to say something, but a nurse stood by the door, covering her mouth. Oh my God, Lan Yu, who had just woken up in a vegetative state, wanted to sleep with the most handsome doctor in their hospital, Dr. Qin. Oh my God, if Dr. Qin was taken by Lan Yu, what would happen to the female doctors and nurses who were still single? The nurse gasped at the door, obviously hearing it. Qin Chen's voice sounded coldly, "Get out." His voice could not be refused. The nurse felt so wronged because Dr. Qin had never been so fierce to them, so she ran out with tears in her eyes. And Qin Chen turned around, looked at Lan Yu indifferently, and said softly, "So troublesome." He said it so coldly that if Lan Yu was a woman, he would definitely fall in love with him. Qin Chen pressed his hands on the side of his body, and looked at him indifferently. Try it. Lan Yu's thin face trembled a little, but what he said was completely irrelevant. Qin Chen, am I very ugly now? Dr. Qin's face was almost distorted, and he gritted his teeth. Yes. Or what? There was something disillusioned in Lan Yu's eyes. He looked at Qin Chen for a long time before he said in a low voice, I know. Then, he slightly avoided the pretty boy's face and tried to feel his own legs. That leg, in his perception, almost did not exist. Only when the quack stabbed him did he feel that the leg was conscious. The quack said that pain meant that there was hope. But sometimes, Lan Yu would rather not be saved, because it was too painful. He tried very hard to move. After a long time, only the muscles in his legs trembled, and then, there was nothing. But he really moved his lower body a little. He raised his eyes and looked at Qin Chen with disbelief and ecstasy. Lan Yu was also a human being. He also yearned to be able to walk and jump instead of lying here like a cripple. The decadence he had felt in the past seemed to have disappeared in an instant. All that was left was desire. He looked at Qin Chen's eyes, which were very bright and a little burning. Qin Chen was still very cold. He ignored the look in Lan Yu's eyes and just said indifferently, if you want to leave, you have to stab me once a day. Lan Yu did not say anything. Qin Chen put down the leg of his trousers and quietly put away the things. You rest. When he was about to walk out, Lan Yu suddenly asked indifferently, Did you have a medical accident? Is my situation similar to that person's? Qin Chen's body froze, but he did not turn back. He only said coldly, Lan Yu, curiosity kills the cat, and it's too easy for me to kill you. With that, he walked out, leaving Lan Yu to look at the closed door. Chapter 24:19. He was sure that Qin Chen was evading because he was right about part of the truth. A doctor with a story, who was unbelievably beautiful. Lan Yu even thought that the patient must be very important to him. Was it a man or a woman? He would figure it out in the future. When Qin Chen walked out, he stood at the door for a while. He wanted to smoke again, but he tried his best to control himself. Because this was a hospital and he was a doctor. He took a deep breath, and the skin on his face twitched a little. It took a while for it to calm down. When he walked back to the emergency room, the family of 3 had moved to the VIP ward on the top floor. After Qin Chen asked the nurse about the situation, he did not disturb them anymore. Yi Muyun's condition was not that bad anyway. Come to think of it, he could make the little guy call him father by hurting himself. If it were him, he would have to draw his blood too. On the top floor, Xiao Yishu was lying comfortably in Yi Muyun's arms. She hugged him worriedly because she was afraid that Yi Muyun would shit himself. There were tear stains at the corner of his eyes. He looked quite pitiful. Cher was lying on the sofa opposite them. She looked at them, especially at Yi Muyun's faint smile. Her lips moved. There were some words that she did not say. She felt very happy. Yi Muyun waved at her and smiled. She walked over and lay down beside him, with the little guy between them. Are you all right? Snow held his hand, the corners of her lips curling up into a smile. You scared me. His face was still very pale. She was a little worried. Yi Muyun held her hand. His palm was very warm, and her heart gradually calmed down. Schwa, let's get married. His voice was hoarse and gentle as he spoke. As he spoke, he even lowered his head and leaned over to kiss her forehead. She was a little surprised, but there was more tenderness in her heart. She hugged his arm and rubbed her face against him. Her voice was very soft. But you are not handsome at all. I don't look good either. I don't have any flowers or diamond rings yet. After thinking for a moment, he hurriedly added. Yi Muyun looked at her, and the corners of her lips curled up slightly. What if there is? Cher widened her eyes and looked at him in disbelief. Holding her and the child with one arm, he fished in his pocket with the other and took out a small box. Cher was even more surprised. Originally, I wanted to propose at home last night. We even prepared a cake and flowers, but since Miss Tang is in such a hurry, can I do it a little earlier? He opened the box with one hand. Inside was a dazzling 88-carat diamond ring from America. Tears welled up in Cher's eyes, but her lips were trembling, and she couldn't say a single word. Yi Muyun pursed his lips and smiled. I'll add something else later. Mrs. Yi, say you're willing. How can you force me like this? She covered her mouth and tears welled up in her eyes. However, she still gently extended her hand to him. Yi Muyun's fingers were trembling, but he didn't put them on her immediately. His gaze fell on her little face, and so did hers. Both of them couldn't help but tear up. He called her Xin Xin. She nodded and looked up at him. Then, she said coquettishly, my hands are tired. He smiled gently and slowly put the dazzling ring on her finger. Then, he reached out and pulled her into his arms. Chapter 24:20. Yi Muyun hugged her tightly. This hug was almost 8 years apart. Even though they had been together for a long time, the meaning of this hug was different. She had finally returned to his side. He called out her name and kissed her forehead. His voice was scorching hot. Schwer bit down on her lower lip as she hugged him tightly. She didn't want to let go. She believed that he would never let go of her. Just as the two of them were entangled, Xiao Yishu burst into tears. You're squeezing me. It hurts. Yi Muyun and Cher were too agitated earlier on and had forgotten about it. They looked at each other and laughed. Reaching out, he carried the little boy to the side and kissed the child's mother uncontrollably. This was the most precious time in his life and he decided to indulge himself for once. Little Yishu watched from the side. She felt that there was nothing for her to do here, so she climbed down from the back of the house and crawled on the carpet. She opened the door of Men Zi and walked out. Her young parents did not even notice her. There were only 2 wards on the top floor. Other than this ward, the other one was the one that Lan Yu was in. Xiao Yishu knew the way and quickly ran in, closing the door behind her. Lan Yu was lying on the bed. When he heard the sound, he turned his head and saw Xiao Yishu. The little boy's eyes and nose were red. He ran over slowly and threw himself on the bed, burying his face in Lan Yu's arms and calling out, "Daddy," awkwardly. Lan Yu felt a little sour in his heart. This despicable person. Would he not belong to him in the future? This was the child he had raised since he was young. Now, he had to return him to someone else. His skinny palms caressed the little boy gently and his voice was hoarse. Yishu, actually, it was difficult for him to say it, but he still had to say it. You're the child of your mother and Yi Muyun. Daddy has always lied to you. After he said that, he felt empty in his heart. He thought that he had given up on Lan Ting not only because of Cher, but also because of Yishu. He had personally taken care of this little person for 5 years. These 5 years, he had shit and peed, it was so hard and sweet. He was no different from her biological father. His love for her was no less than her biological father's. Xiao Yishu's voice was also gloomy. I know. Good that you know. Lan Yu was still holding her little head. You have to listen to your father in the future. He is a very capable person. Daddy Lan too. Xiao Yishu hurriedly said. Then, she reached out and hugged Lan Yu tightly. In the future, I still have to call you Daddy. I'll come to find you again, okay? She raised her head and looked at Lan Yu with a pleading look on her face. His heart was about to melt, so how could he bear to refuse? Lan Yu hummed in a low voice and kissed her hard. I'll ask the nurse to bring you back. He was originally worried about the little fellow. Now that he saw the little fellow jumping around, he was relieved. Xiao Yishu frowned and said very softly, Daddy and Mommy are getting married. They don't have time to care about me now, because they're kissing. The child's unintentional words made Lan Yu fall into deep thought. After a long time, he only smiled bitterly. Then stay here with Daddy. The little fellow hummed in agreement. Then, she jumped over and leaned on the headboard affectionately. Daddy, I'll tell you a story, okay? Lan Yu hummed in agreement. Then, he slowly fell asleep. Yao Yao's new book, Love and Marriage, Husband, Good Morning. Please bookmark it. Synopsis, be good, just one. On their wedding night, she was hugged by her rich husband and gently coaxed. Mo Xiaobei clutched his pajamas tightly and refused to fulfill the duties of husband and wife. They had agreed on a fake marriage. Why did it become a shameful continuation of the bloodline? After marriage, her husband was as passionate as fire. She said coquettishly, Husband, my legs are sore. I need to rest. Zhang Boyan closed the document and chuckled. I'll carry you back to your room to rest. 5 minutes later, he clenched his fists and cried. No. I want to rest with you. Who said that Zhang Boyan was a celibate Prince Charming? It's a lie. Chapter 24-21. The little girl looked at Lan Yu's sleeping face and stopped talking. She laid her little body flat and slept with Lan Yu. When the couple had kissed enough, they realized that their daughter was missing. Xingyuan Hospital was turned upside down. The surveillance cameras searched every corridor, but they couldn't find her. Lan Yu's ward was the most unlikely place. In the end, it was Qin Chen who came and found it. As soon as he walked into the ward, he saw a fair and chubby little angel sleeping next to Lan Yu. She was very close, and her little face was close to Lan Yu's face. The contrast between beauty and depth. White and black. Qin Chen didn't walk in immediately. He just closed the door and stood by the door, watching quietly for a long time. He was thinking that if Lan Yu didn't look like this, how beautiful it would be to see Xiao Yishu with him. Some people would believe that they were really father and daughter. After all, she was brought up by Lan Yu, and they looked very similar. Qin Chen didn't disturb them. He walked out and dialed Yi Muyun's number. He said calmly, Yishu fell asleep at Lan Yu's place. No one knew what the other side said, but Qin Chen said, ask Sheriff to pick up Yishu in an hour. There will come a time when she and Lan Yu break up. Yi Muyun agreed. This was the difference between Qin Chen and Qin Mu. Qin Chen was also a girl, but he was more like a man. In other words, he was another Yi Muyun in character. They were closer to each other. He wasn't as afraid of her brother as Qin Mu was. On the other side, Yi Muyun hung up the phone and said calmly, she's at Lan Yu's place. Cher was pressed into his arms again, and he kissed her wantonly. The kiss was getting more and more intense. She was a little uneasy. Muyun, your arm is injured. His kiss paused for a moment, and then he started to chuckle. Eventually, he turned over on the bed and looked at his little fellow. What did you think I wanted to do, huh? Cher's little face was very red. She glared at him and wanted to get down. He grabbed her slender arm, and Yi Muyun said in a low voice, when you pick up Xiao Yishu, make it clear to Lan Yu. She turned her head. However, it was obvious that Boss Yi did not want to look at her. He closed his eyes and said in a low voice, "This is the last time, Tang Shui. This is the last time I'll let you see him alone." How domineering. Snow turned around and knelt down beside him, pinching his nose with her small hand. She pinched his nose. He opened his eyes and looked at her deeply. "But I promise that I'm meeting him to give Ishu a very happy childhood," she said seriously. "Mu Yun, will you believe me?" He looked at her, and his heart actually palpitated. However, he still put on a straight face and snorted in displeasure. "Why can't I give her a happy childhood? Why must it be you and another man, huh? You're unreasonable." She was getting bolder now, and she even dared to scold him in his ear. There was some deep meaning in Yi Muyun's eyes. He smiled and pulled her into his arms. "Sleep with me for a while more. When you wake up, you can go and give Ishu a happy childhood with Lan Yu." Cher didn't object anymore. She nestled in his arms obediently and asked him softly, "Are you angry?" Chapter 24-22. Cher couldn't help but laugh as she buried herself in his arms. "Brother, if we're talking about spending time together, of course we've been together for more than 10 years. She imitated the little vixen and whispered in his arms. She looked very seductive. After saying that, she looked at him and smiled wickedly. Yi Muyun couldn't stand it. He grabbed her hair and snorted. "Are you seducing me?" I'm trying to please you." Cher suddenly felt embarrassed again and threw herself into his arms. Her little appearance was simply killing Yi Muyun. He kissed and rubbed her, but it wasn't enough. He only let her go after an hour. Of course, he also gave her some advice. Cher had every reason to believe that if she dared to have anything with Lan Yu, she would probably be skinned when she came back. After she left, Yi Muyun lay alone on the hospital bed and smoked quietly. In the end, he still cared. However, he knew that Cher could give up her relationship with Lan Yu, but it was impossible for Ishu. After all, she was raised by Lan Yu. He also knew that when Cher grew up, she would know what to do. As he smoked, Yi Muyun laughed softly and put out the cigarette. Take good care of your body and give your wife a great future." On the other side, Shui was feeling a little uneasy. After all, she had wronged Lan Yu. Even if it was because of his revenge, he had selflessly given 5 years of his life to her. In addition, he had done so much for Ishu, and he had saved her life. Adding all of this together, what he had done behind her back was not even worth mentioning. She opened the door and walked in carefully. Xiao Ishu was still asleep, but Lan Yu was already awake. His thin face still didn't have much flesh on it. It was still skinny and looked very haggard. He was very different from the Lan Yu of the past. Cher pursed her lips and walked over slowly, sitting next to Lan Yu. She reached out to tuck the blanket in for him and looked into his eyes. He stared at her for a long time before saying, "You never did this in the past." She nodded. "In the past, you were very good to me. I haven't thanked you properly." "There's no need for thanks between husband and wife." Lan Yu looked at her deeply. Cher was a little uneasy and couldn't continue. Lan Yu laughed self-deprecatingly. "Of course, our marriage was invalid." His voice was low. "If I had done it myself back then, I wouldn't have let you off today." "No, you wouldn't." She corrected him boldly. "I wouldn't." Lan Yu's eyes were filled with a little viciousness. Cher pouted her lips and acted a little petulantly, or rather, shamelessly. "You would, because you couldn't bear to leave me." After she said that, Lan Yu's throat felt as though it was blocked. He looked at her, at this young lady. Actually, how was she stupid? She might look stupid, lazy, and unwilling to do anything, but she was actually very smart. She was just spoiled rotten by Yi Muyun since she was young. The person he was infatuated with was molded by another man, and it had nothing to do with him. Lan Yu's lips curled into a bitter smile. You, little rascal. His gaze was a little strange, as though he was struggling. Chapter 24-23. His little one wiped her tears and asked seriously, Lan Yu, can I hug you? Lan Yu pursed his lips and his Adam's apple bobbed. There was a repressed look on his face. After a long while, he finally spat out 2 words coldly, whatever. However, Cher could sense a compromise in his awkwardness. Moreover, he was the one who wanted to hug her anyway. She hugged him and buried her face in his chest. She said in a low voice, Thank you, Lan Yu. His body was very stiff, but she was still talking to him softly, You have to get well. You have to get well. His body was even more stiff. After a long while, he said softly, I will. She hugged him and didn't let go. Qin Chen stood at the door and took a photo of the family of 3. After taking the photo, he admired it for a while and said, This is a wedding gift for my brother. I think he will be very happy. The veins on Lan Yu's forehead were popping. Qin Chen. Qin Chen waved his hand. You don't have to thank me. You will feel motivated just by looking at this photo. You will know why Cher chose my brother and not you. He kindly sent the photo to Yi Muyun and then showed it to Lan Yu. Of course, Lan Yu knew what he looked like now, but he refused to look at it. You are very self-aware. Qin Chen nodded his head in satisfaction and looked at his sister-in-law. His sister-in-law was ashamed. It was embarrassing enough to be seen in such a scene by her brother-in-law, but he had even taken a photo of it. Qin Chen smiled. I've already passed it on to my big brother to keep him on high alert for this marriage. Cher almost fainted. She was already thinking about how she would be skinned when she went back. She quickly sat up and glared at Qin Chen. You. Is this how you treat your patients as a doctor? No, I'm just showing special concern for Mr. Lan Yu. After all, Mr. Lan Yu is an outstanding young artist, and I admire him very much. Qin Chen said calmly, without any change in his expression. At this time, Lan Yu said, I will get better soon. I won't let down Dr. Qin's kindness. Qin Chen smiled and blinked, I'll be waiting. Cher looked at Qin Chen and then at Lan Yu. Why did she feel that there was something unusual between them? Like a confrontation, but also like mutual seduction. Cher almost peed her pants. She knew that Qin Chen was a girl, and it wouldn't be a big deal if they got together. But obviously, they. Qin Chen despised Lan Yu, and they ridiculed each other. And Lan Yu didn't seem to know that Qin Chen was a girl. So, there was something wrong with Lan Yu. Cher's eyes shrunk a little. The way she looked at Lan Yu showed that she had opened a new door to the world. And Lan Yu was a little annoyed. Qin Chen smiled and picked up little Shui and his little niece. Big brother is a little anxious from waiting. You know how jealous he is. Let's go back. I'll take good care of this place. When he said the last 2 words, he said it in a very warm tone. Cher opened her eyes wide. Qin Chen deliberately teased her. He reached out and threw them out together. He threw Xiao Yishu into her arms. Go back quickly. Be careful not to catch a cold. Cher, why did Qin Chen go back to the ward again? To seduce Lan Yu again. She suddenly thought that maybe Qin Chen did it on purpose so that Lan Yu would give up faster. Chapter 24-24. However, once Cher turned around, life would not be easy anymore. Mr. Yi, who had received the photo, had already thought of 1,000 ways to skin her alive. In the end, he decided to leave it at home to torture her. Everything was peaceful. It was so peaceful that Cher wondered if Qin Chen had lied to her. Could it be that Qin Chen had not sent the photo to Yi Muyun at all? However, since he did not say anything, she did not dare to ask. Mr. Yi had his own selfish motives. Moreover, it was not a big problem. He only stayed in the hospital for 2 days before returning home with his wife and child. On the day of his return, it was still snowing lightly. He wore a gray coat and carried Xiao Yishu, who was tightly wrapped up. Cher followed behind him and asked worriedly, "Is your arm all right?" Yi Muyun laughed. "What's wrong with it? I just need to carry her with one hand." What a despicable person. With that said, he kissed Xiao Yishu. Xiao Yishu looked disgusted. However, when they got into the car, she obediently hugged her father's neck. The little girl was still traumatized. She was afraid that something would happen to her father. Yi Muyun's heart warmed. Although the little girl did not seem to be very satisfied with him, she probably cared about it. Her bad temper was very much like him. He kissed her again and again. Xiao Yishu still looked disgusted, but she quietly moved her face closer to him. Yi Muyun did not kiss her anymore. The little girl looked disappointed, but the baby did not say anything. Cher laughed to death. She felt that Xiao Yishu was very much like him. Yi Muyun and Shui exchanged a glance. There was a profound look in their eyes. The car drove steadily. Xiao Yishu hugged her father and refused to get out of the car. This child was probably a little reliant on him. Yi Muyun lowered his head and said in a low voice, "Baby, Daddy is here. Don't be afraid. Nothing will happen again." Xiao Yishu didn't say anything at first. Then, she bit her lips and said softly, "But there's a lot of blood." Her little appearance made Yi Muyun's heart melt. His voice became even softer as he coaxed, "Isn't Daddy fine now?" Xiao Yishu's tears were about to come out. Her little hands grabbed his collar tightly. Then Xiao Yishu won't bleed anymore. She didn't want her father to draw blood. This time, she was scared. She was afraid that her father would die. Although Yi Sansan would take Mama away, but he was still Daddy. Yi Muyun had received the little guy's kind intentions, and from time to time, he would coax the little guy. The little fellow fell asleep while feeling sad. Yi Muyun looked at her helplessly, and then looked at the child's mother. How can she sleep so well? She's just like you when you were young, like a little pig. Cher didn't want to take the blame. It's you. You weren't in good health back then. Yi Muyun raised his eyebrows and looked at her with amusement. I remember that there was always a little guy who kept saying that he was tired and kept begging me to let him go. Cher's little face turned red. No way. We have a lot of opportunities and time to experiment. Mr. Ye's voice was very indifferent. Cher bit her lip and glanced at him. Shameless. He smiled and looked down at Xiao Yishu. He felt that life was perfect. Back at the villa, it was still snowing gently. Yi Muyun carried the little guy, and his leather shoes stepped on the snow, leaving shallow footprints. Chapter 24-25. Then he straightened his body and pressed his shoulder. It's heavy. He looked at Cher again. Cher snorted, "You're going to say that I was fat when I was young. Do you still like me if I'm fat?" He smiled and pinched her little face. "I'm doing a good deed every day. I'm saving other men." She wrinkled her little nose and didn't say anything. Yi Muyun held her in his arms and walked out. He rubbed his shoulder. I'm a little tired. Sleep with me. Pig. She whispered. Really? Yi Muyun's eyes were full of threat. Cher snorted, you only know how to sleep all day. If you're not a pig, what are you? There's another kind, and that's a pervert. He said calmly. Cher's expression was one of wariness. He smiled and pushed her into the master bedroom. What else can I do with my arm like this? I probably can't move my body, and I can't do many difficult movements. Cher was speechless. When he arrived at the master bedroom, he directly took off his coat and only wore a pair of trousers and a sweater. He lay comfortably on the bed and waved, little cutie, come here. He rarely talked to her in such a relaxed manner. In the past, he mostly put on the airs of a superior. Cher used to be afraid of him, and now she was still a little unused to it. She moved her feet and still said softly, I'd better stay with Ishu. She'll be afraid when she wakes up. There's something I want to talk to you about. Mr. Yi turned on the serious mode. Oh, Cher didn't dare to be rash. She moved her little feet slowly, but still looked defensive. Will I eat you? He rubbed his eyebrows, feeling angry and amused. You used to be afraid of me. Why are you still afraid of me now? Maybe it's a habit. It's hard to change a habit. She bit her lip and said in a low voice. Mr. Yi nodded in agreement, yes. Otherwise, I wouldn't have liked a stupid pig for so many years. Cher's little face was a little red. She gathered up her courage, you can choose not to like me. His voice was weak, and he did not have much confidence. Yi Muyun chuckled. You said it yourself. I'm used to it. What should I do? I'm used to it. As he spoke, he patted the seat next to him. Little piggy, come sit here with me. Cher was furious. Even if you don't like it, someone else will. Lan Yu. Mr. Yi sneered. Looking at his current state, are you sure you can do it? At this moment, she was already sitting by his side. He reached out and pulled her into his embrace. His voice was extremely low and husky. Do you believe that even if you are with him, I can still seduce you into having an affair? As he spoke, he pressed down on her waist, not letting her move. Cher's face turned red as she snorted, you're shameless. Really? He smiled mysteriously and then took out his phone from his pocket. With a swipe of his slender fingers, a photo appeared on the phone. When Cher saw it, she felt her head heat up. She cursed Chin Chen in her heart, coughed softly and explained, well, didn't you ask me to say goodbye to him? I didn't ask you to say goodbye to him on the bed. Mr. Ye's voice was particularly dangerous. Cher swallowed hard. It's a hospital bed. A hospital bed is also a bed. He reached out and lifted her little chin. What did I say? Cher stared at him blankly, unable to utter a single word. Chapter 24-26. Her little eyes peeked at him secretly, but he remained unfathomable and she couldn't tell what he was feeling. Even though she knew that he was probably pretending, sometimes it was the couple's duty to satisfy each other's vanity. Thus, Cher tried her best to say, brother, you're the only one in my heart. Is that so? He looked at her coldly, as if he didn't quite believe her. Cher smiled. Of course it's true. With that said, she kissed his chin. Do you believe me now? Tang Cher, are you coaxing a pig? Mr. Yi snorted. Cher's expression was especially silly. Brother, you're so smart. I am. Yi Muyun even wanted to strangle her to death. Then, she ignored her. Cher lay in his arms carefully, avoiding his wound. Are you angry? What do you think? Mr. Yi said rather proudly. Cher chuckled softly and lay in his arms coquettishly. Don't be angry anymore. I'll sing for you, okay? Yi Muyun looked at her and sneered. Do you think I'll fall for the trick you used to coax on you? Schwapper smiled. Then there's nothing left, big brother. He glared at her. She really wasn't afraid of him now. He wanted to act like a superior, but he couldn't seem to keep a straight face. In the end, Mr. Yi gave up. Cher kissed his lips boldly, and his gaze immediately became a little meaningful. Cher's voice was soft. Brother, do you like it this way? He narrowed his eyes and stared at her. Tang Cher. Actually, brother is very coquettish on the outside. Cher's little hands teased him boldly, kissing and teasing him at the same time. His breathing was a little chaotic. He grabbed her little hand and his eyes were burning. You're acting a little like Chin Chin. Why? Did he teach you that? Cher laughed and buried her head in his arms. She laughed so hard that his heart felt a little numb. She bit him through the layer of sweater and crawled over to his ear. How would Chin Chin know what brother likes in bed? As soon as she said this, Yi Muyun's gaze became somewhat meaningful. Are you trying to please me? Her voice was muffled as she continued to kiss him. Is brother happy? He leaned against the headboard and narrowed his eyes. You want to make me happy, huh? That's right, as long as big brother is happy, I'm willing to do anything. She kissed the corner of his mouth, trying to seduce him. She was probably certain that his arm was injured and couldn't do anything, so she deliberately said that. Sure enough, he pressed her back and said in a hoarse voice, really? For some reason, Schwacker sensed danger in his voice. She looked up at him. Yi Muyun's voice was low and hoarse. It's easy to make me happy, he whispered a few words into her ear, and Cher's face turned red. After all, such a thing was too shameful. Why, you don't know how to do it. Do you want me to teach you, huh? His voice was hoarse. He held her in his arms, and the lines on his arms were tense. His little wife bit him angrily. Carnivore. Mr. Yi didn't deny it shamelessly. He held her and said, now I'll give you two choices. Chapter 24-27. His little girl looked at him eagerly. What's the choice? Yi Muyun pinched her little chin gently. His voice was low and hoarse. The first choice is that you do it. Before he could finish, his little friend asked, what about the second choice? Mr. Yi smiled meaningfully. There's still the second choice. That is. I'll do it with my injury. Cher's little face fell. She moved her little body to the side and peeked at him secretly. She felt that it was terrible. Was he really going to do that? It was broad daylight. The thought of that scene made her legs go weak, very reluctant. Mr. Ye's voice was slightly hoarse. In that case, I'll do it myself. Cher quickly blocked him. Her voice was timid as if she was about to cry. Let me do it. He leaned against her without moving. His eyes were deep, but there was a small cluster of sparks burning in them. Cher bit her lip. She crawled over carefully and kissed his lips. He looked at her. She was about to cry. She didn't know how to do it so clumsily. He was actually not comfortable with her being so clumsy, but he insisted on letting her do it. In the end, it was a little messy, but he really enjoyed it. However, Mr. Yi, who had enjoyed it, still refused to let her go. He took her into his arms and coaxed her to do it again. After that, little Cher lay in his arms. She poked his chest with her little finger and said angrily, "You're a bad guy." Yi Muyun chuckled and kissed her. Why? Didn't you tell me not to stop just now? Cher was even more furious. He was the one who wanted it, but he had to force her to do it. Thinking of the embarrassing situation, she felt ashamed and buried her body in silence. After a while, she found her conscience. She looked up and said hesitantly, "Are you feeling uncomfortable?" "I feel very comfortable." Mr. Yi smiled and deliberately misinterpreted her words. Cher bit his chin angrily. "I mean, do you want me to help you clean it up?" Yi Muyin chuckled, reached out to pinch her little chin, and said in a low voice, "If you don't think it's dirty." Then, he laughed even more wantonly. "But I don't think so." Just now, Cher's face was as red as a monkey's butt. She covered his mouth and said, "Don't say it." He smiled and gazed at her. Then, he kissed her on the lips. It was a very gentle kiss. Her heart skipped a beat. After kissing her, he smiled and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Yi." Cher snorted softly and got off the bed. She went to get a hot towel to wipe him down, but during the process, his eyes seemed to move a little. Cher's movement slowed, and she glared at him. Yi Muyun closed his eyes slightly and said in a hoarse voice, "Don't worry about it." Cher snorted as she worked. "I told you that you're a carnivore." He laughed uncontrollably. He reached out to rub her long hair and said meaningfully, "When my injuries are healed, I will definitely repay Mrs. Yi." There was nothing wrong with what he said, but Cher had goosebumps when she heard it. She thought of the miserable life in the future. She would be pressed down every day. With a bitter face, she simply wiped him down, changed her clothes, and ran out. He did not stop her because he was indeed a little tired. It was only 2 days ago that he had lost a lot of blood. Moreover, he had lost 2 times in a row. Chapter 24-28. After he got up, he went to check on the little guy first. He was still sleeping. His little face was rosy from sleep and looked very beautiful. He stood by the bed and stroked the little guy's little face very gently. His eyes were filled with the warmth of a loving father. After accompanying the little guy for a while and seeing that there were no signs of him waking up, he slowly went downstairs. At this time, he had already changed into a set of home clothes. He was wearing gray casual pants and a white turtleneck sweater. It was very homey and he looked very young and good-looking. Cher was busy in the kitchen. Her little figure walked around in front of the counter in a cute manner while he watched from not far away. The servant was about to pour him a cup of fruit tea. He looked down and was a little disgusted. The servant whispered, "Miss drinks it often." Mr. Yi reluctantly drank 2 mouthfuls and was surprised to find that the apple tasted quite good. Then he looked up and saw that she was busy. The snow had stopped and the sun shone into the kitchen. It was very bright and warm. At this time, his little friend was wearing a fluffy jumper. It was the kind of bunny and her long hair was tied into a ponytail. She looked young as if she was 18 years old. His throat tightened as he remembered that when she was 18 years old, they were engaged. At that time, they were both young and too impulsive. He treated her as his everything and she was afraid of him. At that time, their relationship was not mature. But these 8 years. Thinking about it now, he actually had a feeling that he did not regret it. In the kitchen, Cher was flipping through the menu while brewing some unknown soup. Her little face was so focused that she did not notice him coming in. "What are you doing?" Yi Muyun hugged her little body from behind, his voice a little hoarse. "Oh," Cher replied and then smiled sweetly. "I heard that beef bone soup is good for your health." Yi Muyun nibbled on her little neck. She was fragrant and soft. He was a little restless again, but when he thought about his own body, he restrained himself. "You finally feel sorry for me, huh?" He smiled and looked at the soup she was brewing. Although he didn't like it, he still cared about her feelings. Cher tilted her head and looked a little silly. No, it's for Lanyu. His body is weak, and I saw that the Lan family didn't specially prepare meals for him. He's always on an 4-drip. How is he nutritious? Yi Muyun's face darkened, and his voice was low and hoarse. Did you develop feelings after hugging her on the hospital bed? Cher reached out and pinched his nose. Petty. For this matter, no man can be so generous. He hugged her and nibbled on her little ear, his voice warm as well. I was the one who exerted myself in bed. I was also the one who made you comfortable, but she wanted to make tonic soup for Lanyu, so of course he cared. Cher's legs went soft from his kiss. She stammered, can you be more reasonable? I'm already very reasonable. Yi Muyun's face was expressionless. I want to drink it first. Cher couldn't argue with him. Fortunately, she had endured a lot, so she said generously, all right. I'll fill a bowl for you. Only then did Mr. Yi sit at the small dining table in satisfaction, waiting for her soup. She carefully filled a small bowl for him and then sat opposite him, asking for praise. Yi Muyun took a sip, and his eyebrows moved slightly. Then, he finished the small bowl without a change in expression. Cher was extremely satisfied. Not bad, right? Yeah. He had a look of approval on his face. It's not bad. I also think that I made a big fuss just now, so I'll give this to Lanyu. If you want to poison, then poison that man to death. Chapter 24-29. Cher was a little touched. He seemed to be much easier to talk to than before. She nodded and said, I'll ask the driver to take it to the hospital later. Yi Muyun smiled and asked casually, you're not going yourself? She immediately hugged his arm and smiled sweetly. I'll stay at home with you. Yi Muyun looked at her and smiled. He didn't say anything. He just walked to the counter and took the ingredients to cook. Let me do it. Your wound hasn't healed yet. Cher hurried to help. Yi Muyun's eyes flickered. You can put the tonic soup you made in a thermos and ask the driver to send it over. Cher stuck out her tongue. I almost forgot. Thereupon, he hurriedly packed the soup and ran out in a puff of smoke. Yi Muyun kept looking at her with a faint smile in his eyes. He continued to cut the ingredients in his hands. He stewed a small pork ribs and put a few red dates in it. The color looked very beautiful. Schwara ran back and looked at him with a face full of admiration. She laid down on the side and looked around. You did well. Yi Muyun prepared 2 stir-fried vegetables while he was cooking. He asked her while cutting, did you send it over? Cher hugged his arm and said coquettishly, I sent it over. Big brother, you're so good. You're so considerate. She smiled and her eyes curved. He tilted his head. Is there no reward? What reward? She asked, deliberately surprised, and then abruptly gave him a light kiss. She laughed when she kissed him. She tiptoed and asked softly against his lips, do you like such a reward? He patted her with his hand. I like it. In the future, you can make a soup for Lanyu every day. He started to cut the vegetables again. Cher hung on his arm. He said helplessly, Cher, didn't you say that my arm was injured? She pretended to be innocent. This arm is not injured. Then she clung to him affectionately, as merry as a puppy. And as long as he saw her happy appearance, his heart would also be somewhat satisfied. He asked with a faint smile, have you tasted your soup? You've tried it. Cher laughed. It's your first time making it. Isn't it good? Yi Muyun tilted his head. His gaze was deep and serene. Then, he smiled meaningfully. Not bad. You behaved well, and didn't cry too much. The more Cher listened, the more she felt that something was wrong. Finally, she understood what he was talking about. Naughty. She bit his shoulder angrily. Don't say that again. She was always shy, so her face was red. Yi Muyun smiled and carried her onto the counter. Learn a little. You have to cook for me in the future. I don't want to. She shook her feet. You can do it. After she said that, she found that he was looking at her again. She blushed. I didn't mean that. Yi Muyun is too hateful. He smiled slightly. Is that so? However, he didn't explain. He just continued to cook. Not only did he make a meal for two, but he also made a baby meal for Xiao Yishu. It was a heart-shaped mushroom rice. It looked especially delicious. Cher frowned. It's something young girls like, but Yishu might not like it too much. Chapter 24:30. He said it seriously, so Cher passed the responsibility to him. Then I'll leave Yishu's education to you from now on. Mr. Yi raised his eyebrows and said with a smile, what else can I do? Count on you. He looked at her with disdain. Tang Cher, don't forget that I was the one who taught you when you were young. Cher was displeased. That's why I'm so stupid. It's all your fault. After saying that, she covered her mouth and looked at him with her eyes wide open. I take back my words. Yi Muyun chuckled. Yeah, who's to blame for being so stupid? He reached out and knocked her little head. You're so stupid. Cher lowered her head and did not say anything. She thought to herself, how could I be so stupid? Yi Muyun gently hugged her in her arms and coaxed her softly. However, her voice carried a hint of a smile. What do you think we should do? I hope our child is even a little bit like me and won't be so stupid. Cher was so angry that she glared at him. Yi Muyun laughed. Sit down and eat. I'll go and carry Xiao Yishu down. She had nothing to say and ate in silence. However, her stomach was soon conquered by his superb cooking skills. Then, she remembered that there was still a small bowl of soup that she had made just now. She wanted to taste which of them was better at cooking. Cher really went to taste it with great confidence. However, after taking a small sip, she spat it out with a bitter face. Oh my God, what is this? It was sour but not sour, sweet but not sweet, salty but not salty. It was a strange taste that she could not put into words. Cher stuck out her tongue and looked for water to drink. Just then, Yi Muyun came in and looked at her. What's wrong? Cher took a sip of the water as she pointed at the soup she had made. This tastes terrible. Oh, it's okay. Mr. Yi put Xiao Yishu on the seat and said calmly. Cher looked at him suspiciously. Okay. She then asked, do you really think it's okay? Mr. Ye's level was very high. When he lied, he was very calm. He said calmly, it's alright, but it's not as good as mine. So our Xiao Yishu will eat Daddy's cooking, The little fellow was sleeping soundly, sitting obediently with a snow-white scarf wrapped around his body. He looked like a cute little animal. Yi Muyun liked him the moment she saw him. She kissed him and sat at the side to serve the little princess as she ate her meal. Cher looked at his calm expression and wondered if there was something wrong with her taste buds. She gritted her teeth and took another sip. Wah, she spat it out again. It was really disgusting. This time, she was suspicious of Yi Muyun's taste buds, but she forgot to suspect the extent of his black-bellied nature. What should I do? Will Anya get sick from eating too much? Cher thought about it. I need to call the driver. As she said that, she was about to make the call. Mr. Yi raised his hand to look at the time and did not stop her. Cher dialed the driver's number. After talking for a while, her face fell. What? He's back. She put down the phone and jumped to the door. As expected, the driver was back. Cher looked back at Yi Muyun and stuck out her tongue. Will Anya be poisoned to death by me? No. It's just a little disgusting. He smiled and comforted her. But she heard something from his words and glared at him. Yi Muyun, did you know that it was disgusting, so you asked me to give it all to him? Chapter 24:31. Cher was furious. If it weren't for Ishu, she would have scolded him. At this time, Mr. Yi added another stab. Otherwise, why would you say that you're stupid? You believe everything others say, huh? Cher sat at the dining table angrily. She didn't say anything and just ate. She would never, ever, believe him again. Yi Muyun was still feeding the little fellow, taking the time to look at her angry face. She didn't know how gentle his eyes were, she didn't know how cute his little heart was. She didn't know how happy he was. At the hospital, Qin Chen was holding a thermos in his hand. It was sent by his brother's driver and said that Cher made it. If Tang Cher knew how to make soup, Qin Chen would write her name upside down. However, she still opened the thermos and smelled it. It smelled a little strange. She closed it and walked happily to the VIP ward. What a black-bellied brother. When she opened the door, Lan Yu was leaning on the hospital bed. In front of him was the nutritious meal that the hospital had prepared for him. It was the kind of beef and spinach that would make him nauseous if he ate too much. Qin Chen walked in and shook the thermos in his hand. He coughed softly. Your ex-wife made this for you. Lan Yu looked up at him and snorted. What ex-wife? Tang Cher, my current sister-in-law. Qin Chen didn't care about stabbing him in the heart. Sure enough, Lan Yu's face darkened. He glared at him. I really want to dig your heart open and see if it's black. Dr. Qin, are you happy when others are in pain? No. Qin Chen stretched out a slender finger and shook it gently. I'm very happy. Lan Yu's face darkened even further as he glared at him. Qin Chen didn't mind his gloomy face. He sat by the bed and kindly opened the thermos for him. Actually, we're relatives, aren't we? Who's your relative? Lan Yu snorted coldly. Pretty boy, stop it. Qin Chen flicked his finger. It seems that you don't want to drink this soup, right? Lan Yu snorted. Who said that? As he spoke, he reached out and grabbed his food, immediately scooped a bowl, and eagerly gulped it down. He had only drunk half of it when it got stuck in his throat. It was too fucking disgusting. Was this soup or poison? Lan Yu coughed and spat it out. He glared at Qin Chen. Are you trying to poison me to death? I can't inherit your legacy. Why would I poison you to death? Qin Chen knew that he wouldn't drink it anymore, so he kindly reminded him. This is probably Cher's first time cooking. My brother might not have eaten it before. Lan Yu, you're still being picky. If Cher finds out, she'll be sad. Lan Yu gritted his teeth. How could your brother not know how disgusting this is? If it was good, why would he send it here? It had to be said that men knew men best. Qin Chen got up and carried the small bucket. Let's share if there's something good. He walked out and poured the contents. This thing was just a prank. If he drank too much and caused Lan Yu to fall ill, he would have to spend effort to save him. He hated bowel cleansing the most. But even though Lan Yu only drank a mouthful, he still fell ill. Bowel cleansing and whatnot were all gone. Chapter 24:32. Qin Chen took off his mask and said to his brother seriously, "Sorry to trouble you, brother. Don't let Cher send soup to the hospital anymore in the future." On the other side, Yi Muyun seemed to be a little slow. "What's wrong?" "Intestinal cleansing and gastric lavage." Qin Chen said word by word, "What do you think is wrong?" He was a man who was very particular about his character. It was okay to see some blood during surgery, but intestinal cleansing and gastric lavage were what he hated the most. Yi Muyun chuckled. "Don't you always say that you're a doctor and saving patients is your duty? At that time, didn't you use this reason to escape your family's responsibility? Now, intestinal cleansing and gastric lavage make you sick." Then, Mr. Yeat said something that made Qin Chen vomit. In the past, Lan Yu was quite good-looking. Qin Chen cursed in his heart. He was speechless and hung up the phone. When he turned around and saw Lan Yu's dying appearance, he sighed in his heart. People should not have bad intentions. Otherwise, they would get themselves into trouble. The nurse came over and said softly, "Dr. Qin, why don't you take a rest? We'll take care of him here. Mr. Lan's condition is quite good now." Qin Chen nodded. His slender body flashed out, and his pace was very fast. He was eager to take a shower. As soon as he arrived at the private office, he took off his white coat. However, at this time, he was a little addicted to smoking again, so he stood in front of the window, took out a cigarette, lit it and smoked quietly. After 2 puffs, his nose was filled with the smell of intestinal cleansing just now. He cursed in a low voice and pinched the cigarette. "Go fucking save the dying and help the injured." As he took off his sweater, he took it off from the top of his head. From the inside to the outside, he was almost at the door of the bathroom. It was a thin, slender woman's body without a trace of excess flesh. However, it was almost as flat as a man's. However, it still had that kind of abstinence and temptation. Especially at the waistline was tight, making people feel like they were in and out. He stood under the shower and let the water wash over his body. Under the dense steam, he wiped his face and nimbly pulled a towel from the side and draped it over his body. When he walked out, he had already changed into a clean set of clothes. The previous set of clothes worth hundreds of thousands had been thrown into the trash can. After taking a shower, Qin Chen felt that the air was much fresher. He wanted to light a cigarette, but before he could, a nurse ran over and greeted him, "Dr. Qin." Qin Chen tilted his head. "What's wrong?" "Mr. Lan wants to see you." The nurse smiled. "Dr. Qin, don't worry. Mr. Lan is fine." Qin Chen smiled. "Of course it's good. My sweetheart sent me takeout. I'm still in a good mood. Love is great." The nurse didn't understand, but she still urged him to go. Qin Chen walked over slowly, but he forgot to wear his white coat. At this time, he was wearing a grass-colored shirt, a diamond-shaped plaid sweater, and black trousers. He was very handsome, and those little fresh meats couldn't compare to him. The most important thing was his temperament. There was a clean smell on Qin Chen's body, and it felt like he was not stained by a speck of dust. In particular, it made women not dare to take the initiative to provoke him, and only dared to admire him. Chapter 24:33. Qin Chen stood there and smiled. Last words. Lan Yu just looked at him and didn't say anything. Qin Chen pursed his lips. What the hell? He still walked over slowly and asked the nurses to leave. When everyone was gone, he stood by the bed and said coldly, if you want revenge, you have to stand up first. Lan Yu took a deep breath. There was a faint light in his deep-set eyes. He looked at Qin Chen and said, "Come closer." Qin Chen didn't suspect anything and still bent down slightly. Suddenly, Lan Yu's hand grabbed his hand. That thin and weak hand was surprisingly strong at this moment as it grabbed Qin Chen. Of course, if Qin Chen tried to break free, he could. However, he was a little hesitant at this moment because if he used too much strength, Lan Yu would probably fracture his bones. He didn't want to trouble himself to treat his fracture. However, it was because of this hesitation that Lan Yu actually grabbed his hand and covered it in an indescribable place. Qin Chen's eyebrows twitched as he looked at Lan Yu with a deep gaze. "Can you feel it? It's awake." Lan Yu stared at his eyes. "You said that you would let me try." Qin Chen didn't move his hand away, but his face was a little cold. He raised his eyebrows and said, "So?" Lan Yu pulled his hand and dragged Qin Chen down. Qin Chen fell straight on top of him in a very disheveled manner that was completely different from his usual cold and noble demeanor. And the cause of all this was a vegetable that had just woken up. Just as he waved Lan Yu away and was about to get up, something cold blocked his lips. Qin Chen was stunned. He forgot to get up and just stared at the man in front of him coldly. He didn't push the man in front of him away and let him kiss him. He just said coldly, "Do you know what you're doing?" Like him, Lan Yu's eyes were cold. "Dr. Qin, I'm sober now." He bit Qin Chen's lips. "I just want you to remember the taste." After that, he let go of Qin Chen with a cold smile on his lips. Dr. Qin seems to enjoy it very much. Qin Chen straightened his body and looked down at Lan Yu, his slender fingers stroking his lips. His lips were now suffused with a devilish shade of red, which made him look particularly alluring. He spoke softly, "I've kissed someone more flavorful." He paused for a moment, then said word by word, "Your kiss reminds me of the taste of washing my intestines." After that, Qin Chen turned around and left, feeling refreshed. "Where are you going?" Lan Yu's voice carried a man's unique naughtiness. "Why, are you going to solve it yourself?" Qin Chen stopped in his tracks. "I'm going to take another shower and brush my teeth 8 times. Lan Yu was a little shocked. "Does my kiss make you feel so uncomfortable?" Qin Chen curled his lips. "What do you think?" "I'll ask the nurse to bring a mirror later. Mr. Lan will probably know the answer." What a black-hearted doctor. What a poisonous mouth. However, looking at Qin Chen's embarrassment, Lan Yu was a little satisfied. He hadn't felt that little happiness in a long time. He felt happy when he teased others and made them angry. It seemed that he hadn't felt happiness since 8 years ago. He was finally sleepy. He rubbed his head again and took out a carrot. He brought it to his lips and bit it a few times. This kid was scared to death just like that. Chapter 24-34. Of course, Qin Chen didn't brush his teeth 8 times. When he looked at the mirror and brushed his teeth for the 3rd time, he suddenly thought of Lan Yu's kiss. To be honest, it didn't feel that bad. At least, he didn't hate it. It was him who forced himself to hate it. Because Lan Yu wasn't that person. He wasn't the person who moved his heart. He wasn't the person who held him and watched the sun rise and set. That person was no longer there. Qin Chen's hand rested on the basin. He told himself over and over again that that person was no longer there. He also jumped off a building to his death. How long had he been dead? A few years. He never dared to think about how long that person had been gone. He didn't dare to think about the little things that happened between them. That person was his patient, a patient he took care of during his internship. He was so tall and strong, but he couldn't escape fate. In the end, he couldn't bear the torment of his illness and left. With a leap, he ended his own life. Qin Chen didn't even look at him for the last time. His family said that he was cruel, but he couldn't do it. Because looking at him meant that that person had really left. Looking at him meant that that person had left forever. Qin Chen's eyes were a little empty. He looked at himself in the mirror, and his image overlapped with that person. He didn't want to admit that he had been imitating that person. He pretended that he hadn't left. He was still alive, and he was him, his fingers clutched at the position of his heart. He raised his head and made a painful sound. 10 minutes later, Qin Chen took his car keys and left. He drove his convertible sports car onto the highway and sped like crazy. He drove all the way to 150 kilometers per hour until he was stopped by the traffic police and brought to the police station. It only took a word from Mr. Yi to release him, but Qin Chen didn't go to work for 2 days. In the VIP ward of Xingyuan Hospital, Lan Yu looked at the young nurse and said calmly, "Let Dr. Qin come." The young nurse didn't think too much and said directly, "Dr. Qin, he's on leave for 2 days. Vacation." Lan Yu leaned against the headboard, his gaze a little deep. The nurse actually quite liked Lan Yu. After all, he used to be a talented and handsome guy, so the nurse took good care of him. However, the young nurses all had a little plan in their hearts. After a long time, they always felt that there was some unspeakable warmth between Dr. Qin and Mr. Lan that was faintly flowing. The nurse pondered for a moment. That Dr. Qin was on the news yesterday. Girl Nu Chang has been caught, huh? Lan Yu said nonchalantly, but his ears had already pricked up. It was hard to imagine a man like Qin Chen taking the initiative to get close to a woman. His whole body was filled with an aura of abstinence, as if he was not interested in women. He had never looked at any beautiful nurses, but he was very respectful to women. As Lan Yu thought about it, sweat broke out on his back. He realized that he seemed to be too concerned about Qin Chen. The young nurse laughed. "Mr. Lan, what are you thinking about? Our Dr. Qin is a very decent person. Why would he go to that kind of place?" The young nurse paused for a moment and looked at Lan Yu cautiously. She found that Mr. Lan seemed to be relieved. Her heart skipped a beat. Dr. Qin and Mr. Lan really had a little romance. Oh my God, 2 men. Chapter 24:35. Lan Yu looked at the nurse, who hesitated for a moment before saying, "It's like this, Dr. Qin drove a little faster on the highway, so, how much is a little faster?" Lan Yu's voice was indifferent. The young nurse silently swallowed her saliva. "Let's say 150, 150 was a little faster?" Lan Yu's face darkened, then he said in a low voice, "Was he arrested?" "He was released that night." "He's Mr. Ye's brother, who would dare not release him?" The nurse said, her voice trembling. Although Dr. Qin was just a doctor, he came from a wealthy family. The sports car he drove was worth more than 20 million, and the clothes he wore were worth hundreds of thousands. Being a doctor was just a hobby, and the shares he owned in King Entertainment were enough for him to eat for 10 lifetimes. Therefore, many nurses at Xingyuan Hospital liked Dr. Qin, but no one dared to pursue him, mainly because their backgrounds were too different. Without the same background, it was difficult to live together. In this day and age, women were not only realistic, but also self-aware. Lan Yu didn't make a sound, lying quietly for a while as the nurse massaged his wounds. He seemed to have forgotten the pain, and only frowned occasionally. The nurse quietly finished his treatment, tidied his clothes, and was about to leave when Lan Yu asked, "Do you know where Dr. Qin lives?" The nurse was stunned. "This is Dr. Qin's privacy, I can't say even if I know." Although she said that, her eyes were full of gossip. Indeed, Mr. Lon and Dr. Chin had something going on. The nurse decided to retreat for the sake of her job. Dr. Chin couldn't be offended, but if she accidentally revealed it, it wouldn't be a problem. Lon Yu raised his eyebrows. So, you know. The nurse smiled. Last time when I went to deliver the documents, I found out that Dr. Chin lives in the highest condominium on Zhongshan Road, and on the top floor. It's super luxurious, there's only one condominium on each floor, and I heard that each floor is more than 400 square meters. Lon Yu looked at her, then closed his eyes. Can you send me there? The young nurse lowered her head and played with her fingernails. Mr. Lon, you're hospitalized. This is appropriate. 1 million. Lon Yu suddenly said. The young nurse was stunned. 1 million was enough for her to work for 10 years. Moreover, he might not necessarily lose his job. Therefore, the young nurse agreed without hesitation. I'll find a car first. However, Mr. Lon has to cooperate with me on this matter. After all, the treatment at Xingyuan Hospital is quite good. Lon Yu naturally understood the young nurse's shyness. He only said calmly, if you're fired, I'll add another million. The young nurse was extremely excited. She thought to herself, I'm fired, I'm fired. That way, she could go back to her hometown and buy a small apartment. The nurse worked hard. She hid it from everyone and used her strength to transport Lon Yu out in a wheelchair. Then, she got into a taxi. The taxi driver got 1,000 yuan and used his strength to send Lon Yu to the elevator of Qin Chen's building. When they reached the top floor, Lon Yu asked the young nurse and the driver to leave first. He half reclined in the wheelchair and looked at the solid door. It was obvious that this was a super luxurious condominium. This quack really knew how to enjoy himself. Chapter 2436. Lon Yu calmed down a little at this time. He felt that spending 1 million just to see this quack was making a big fuss over a small matter. Moreover, it was something that only a psychopath would do. However, he faintly felt that Qin Chen's abnormality had something to do with him. What kind of past did Qin Chen have? Lon Yu suddenly wanted to know, but he didn't dare to find out. He was a little afraid that he would sink deeper and deeper. He knew very well what it meant to maintain a high degree of curiosity towards someone. However, at this time, even if he regretted it and wanted to leave, he couldn't do it. He was a vegetable that had just woken up. Lon Yu knocked on the door, but the door didn't open. He continued to knock for about a full 10 minutes, but no one came out to open the door. He pressed the doorbell, but he couldn't reach it with his eyes closed. For the first time, he hated that his legs couldn't stand up. He sat in the wheelchair in a daze. After a long time, he felt a little pain. Cold sweat began to appear on his forehead, and he was eager to lie down. Minutes and seconds passed. Half an hour, 1 hour. Lon Yu finally couldn't hold it anymore. He lowered his head and fell asleep. Qin Chen wanted to go out to buy something. When he opened the door, he saw that the vegetable that should have stayed in the hospital was now in front of his door. He stood at the door and looked at Lon Yu quietly. There wasn't much expression on his face. Lon Yu actually woke up. He looked at Qin Chen indifferently and said in a hoarse voice, I heard that you're in a bad mood. What does it have to do with you? Qin Chen's face was indifferent. Then, he walked past the vegetable and entered the elevator. Lon Yu's voice was a little anxious. You just left me behind. I'm your patient. Since you left Xingyuan Hospital, you're not. Dr. Qin's voice was particularly cold, without any human emotion. I don't need to be responsible for your safety. After that, the elevator closed in front of Lon Yu. Lon Yu was stunned. He really didn't expect Qin Chen to be so cold. He thought. Lan Yu chuckled. What did he think it was? Qin Chen just regarded him as a patient. Dr. Qin had a good family background, a good appearance, and a good temperament and talent. How could he take a fancy to a vegetative person like him? Even if he did, he was just a carrot. Lan Yu, other than money, what else did he have? An ugly body covered in scars, a broken body, and an ugly face. He was even dreaming and fantasizing about a male doctor. Lan Yu laughed at himself. His body was so weak that even he despised it. He wanted to leave, but he could not. In the end, he went into shock in front of Dr. Blackheart's house. The moment he fainted, he thought that the black-hearted doctor would send him back to the hospital. A cold and noble man like him would not allow someone like him to die in front of his door. Qin Chen came back an hour later. When the elevator door opened, he frowned. Without looking at the unconscious Lan Yu, he opened the door and went in. His face was numb. He had lost his passion for life and death. He told himself that he was not in the hospital. Whether Lan Yu lived or died, it had nothing to do with him. If someone wanted to die, it was Lan Yu's own doing. Qin Chen tried to empty his mind and forget about Lan Yu at the door. He watched CDs at home and cleaned the house. He was a person with a slight obsession with cleanliness. He did not allow the house to be messy. His life was the same. He alone was enough. He did not need anyone else. Night fell quietly. Qin Chen sat alone on the oversized sofa and watched CDs. It was dark around him. Chapter 24:37. At 1:00 in the night, Qin Chen sat in the dark. He suddenly got up and walked straight to the door. The door opened. Lan Yu was still lying in his wheelchair. His face was already very pale. Qin Chen went forward and checked if he was breathing. It was already very weak, and Lan Yu's body was very cold. It was too cold. If an ambulance was called at this time, Lan Yu probably wouldn't be able to make it there. Qin Chen pursed his thin lips. Without hesitation, he carried Lan Yu. Damn, he's full of boyfriend power. Fortunately, Lan Yu had lost a lot of weight. He was about 110 pounds. Otherwise, Qin Chen wouldn't have been able to carry him. He carried him straight to the master bedroom and connected the oxygen machine. This was prepared by Qin Chen for himself. He had never used it before. He didn't expect it to be used on Lan Yu for the first time. Lan Yu was still unconscious. It wasn't a simple sleep. Qin Chen supported himself on both sides of his body. He unplugged the oxygen machine and pressed hard on the position of Lan Yu's heart a few times. Then, he leaned over and gently pinched Lan Yu's lips to give him artificial respiration. When Qin Chen did all this, there were no distractions in his heart. He just wanted to save a patient. As for artificial respiration, this wasn't the first time. He told himself that it was nothing. The difference was that this man had such thoughts about him. Qin Chen did a few sets of mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, and Lan Yu slowly opened his eyes. Gritting his teeth, he said, "Cold. Cold." Qin Chen slapped him twice and roared at himself, "Are you an idiot? You ran out like this. Aren't you courting death?" Lan Yu turned his head to the side. After a violent cough, he smiled bitterly. "I didn't know Dr. Qin was so cruel. I didn't ask you to come." Qin Chen's voice was very cold. However, he knew that Lan Yu had to warm up immediately. Otherwise, his legs would definitely be crippled. This kind of low temperature is very damaging to the nerves. This idiot. He wanted to die. He wanted to be crippled. Don't drag him down with you. Originally, he was supposed to give Lan Yu hot water, but this idiot's body was too weak. He was afraid that Lan Yu would die halfway through the bath and end up shitting in his bathtub. Think about how alluring the news would be. Qin Chen gave up and began to strip Lan Yu's clothes. What are you going to do? Lan Yu smiled bitterly. Dr. Qin won't let go of a vegetative patient, will he? Qin Chen's movements didn't stop, and he did it quickly and efficiently. The quilt covered Lan Yu's body and his. After a while, Qin Chen's sweater and trousers were thrown out of the quilt and landed on the floor. Lan Yu was hugged. Lan Yu froze. At this moment, Mr. Lan was experiencing the greatest torture and battle of his life. Dr. Qin, do you want to be with me? His voice was extremely hoarse. Have you thought about it clearly? Do you really want to be with me? Qin Chen's voice was very cold. Put away the dirty thoughts in your head. I just don't want your legs to be crippled and the previous medical fees to be spent in vain. Lan Yu was really weak. After fighting with him for so long as he just woke up, he was indeed a little tired. So he closed his eyes gently, but he couldn't ignore the physical contact. This was a man's body. It was very flat, the kind that didn't even have hun muscles, but he just felt different. Qin Chen's body was very seductive. Chapter 24:38. Lan Yu fell asleep in a daze because of the warmth in his heart. As for Qin Chen, his teeth were chattering because of the cold. That damned vegetable. When he woke up, he would immediately throw Lan Yu out of his apartment and then clean the bedroom several times with alcohol. After all, it was night. When Lan Yu's body gradually warmed up, Qin Chen was also a little sleepy. It was a rare night, but he slept so soundly without the disturbance of those dreams. When the sky was slightly bright, he opened his eyes and found that he was hugged very tightly. Qin Chen lay flat and his voice was a little cold. Lan Yu, how long has it been since you last had a woman? You don't even let go of a man. He reached out and pulled Lan Yu's hand away. Lan Yu didn't care. After living with this black-hearted doctor for a long time, his skin had also become much thicker. He smiled. Dr. Qin comes from a good family. His skin is smooth and tender, and he is more delicate than a woman. This was not false at all. Although Qin Chen didn't have a woman's part, his skin was better and more delicate than a woman's. It was just like the feeling of ice and jade in the books. It was very touching. Lowlife. Qin Chen rolled his eyes at Lan Yu and was about to get up. He really didn't wear a shirt, but he wasn't afraid of Lan Yu seeing it because he was flat. However, Lan Yu stopped her and said in a low voice, Qin Chen. Qin Chen was surprised, and then his hand was grabbed by Lan Yu and dragged to a sinful place. Qin Chen's eyes widened, and then he looked at Lan Yu with narrowed eyes. Lan Yu smiled slightly. Dr. Qin, now, do you want to try? Animal. Qin Chen pushed him away and got down. He put on a bathrobe and went to the bathroom. Lan Yu looked at his back. Really, Qin Chen was just as he thought, the kind of handsome man who was gentle and weak. Lan Yu himself was considered thin in the past, but Qin Chen was different. He was born to be a little boy. He didn't think he had a problem in this area, but after seeing Qin Chen's body, he felt that men weren't unacceptable. In the bathroom, Qin Chen took a shower and didn't even close the door. He was not afraid of Lan Yu coming because Lan Yu's legs were not good and he could not walk. After showering, she took a towel to wipe herself clean and changed into a clean set of clothes. As for the clothes that she had hugged Lan Yu the night before, she threw them into the trash can. Qin Chen knew that his life was a little extravagant, but he enjoyed it. It was as if he could look down on all living things, and only then did he find a little sense of living. He came out of the changing room and slowly walked back to the bedroom. He stood at the end of the bed and looked at Lan Yu quietly. I'll call the hospital to pick you up. And then let the hospital find out that the patient is in the bed of the upright Dr. Qin. Lan Yu chuckled. What do you think the hospital will think? I'll keep it a secret, and it won't be spread out. Qin Chen's tone was very indifferent, and his expression was quite intolerable. Lan Yu was still smiling. But what if someone accidentally spreads it out, Dr. Qin? Qin Chen couldn't bear it anymore. Lan Yu, my patience is limited. Of course, you can throw me out and don't care about my life or death. I know Dr. Qin, at most, you just need to live in another place. A patient's death is not a big deal to you. Lan Yu said almost like a rascal. Anyway, he was unwilling to leave. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.